Agnes Simms stood on the cracked driveway of the house on Calloway Street and did not look back. She had 32 years in that house, 2 suitcases on the pavement beside her, and a manila envelope from the county recorder's office in her coat pocket that made it all official. That morning, going through the last of Gene's things in the bedroom closet, she had found something tucked inside the lining of his old travel bag, something that had no business being there, and that would change the course of everything that came after. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. If you believe that the people we love keep finding ways to take care of us long after they are gone, stay right here. Every week on this channel, we bring you the stories that prove love does not end where life does. Now, let's begin. Agnes Simms had lived in the house on Calloway Street in Millhaven, Tennessee since the autumn of 1991, which meant she had lived there through 5 job changes, 2 knee surgeries, the death of her mother and Gene's father, the wedding of her daughter April in the backyard on a Saturday in June, and approximately 11,000 mornings of coffee at the kitchen table with a window that faced the yard. Gene had kept going year after year with the particular stubbornness of a man who believed that a garden left alone was a garden given up on. She knew that house in the way you know a place you have stopped seeing because you have been inside it so long. The particular give of the second floorboard at the top of the stairs. The way the hot water in the bathroom took 4 minutes to arrive in January and 2 in July. The smell of the back hallway in August when the humidity came through the walls and mixed with the old wood and the cedar closet where Gene had kept his tools in the early years before he built the workshop. She knew all of it. She had stopped noticing all of it. That's the thing about a life built slowly in one place. It becomes the air. You breathe it without thinking. You only notice it when it is gone. Gene had died in the March of that year, on a Tuesday, at 6:15 in the morning, in a hospital room they had given him on the 4th floor with a window that faced the parking structure. He had been sick for 14 months. The last 4 of those months had required the kind of care that does not happen at home without significant help, and the significant help had cost what significant help costs, and the costs had accumulated in the way that medical costs accumulate, past the point of what insurance covers and into the territory of what you cover yourself. Agnes had not known the full extent of it until 6 weeks after the funeral, when a woman from a firm in Nashville she had never heard of called her on a Thursday afternoon and explained the situation in the careful language of someone delivering information they have delivered before. Gene had taken out a second mortgage 18 months before he died. He had used the equity in the house on Calloway Street to cover the gap between what the insurance paid and what the treatment cost. The loan had been structured in a way that made sense if he recovered and came home. He had not recovered and come home. The loan had come due. The house, after the numbers were settled, belonged to the bank. She had called April, who drove up from Knoxville that same evening and sat with her at the kitchen table and went through every document twice and then a third time. April was methodical and calm in a crisis in the way of people who work in hospital administration and have learned to process hard information without flinching. She had called the bank's customer line. She had spoken with a housing counselor. She had laid out every option Agnes had, which took less time than Agnes had hoped because the options were limited and most of them led to the same place. Gene had tried to protect her. Agnes understood that without difficulty and without any particular softening of the difficulty, he had made a decision alone because he believed he could resolve it before it became a problem, and then he had run out of time to resolve it, and it had become her problem anyway, which was the shadow side of what had otherwise been 38 years of a man who solved things quietly and brought them to her finished. She had loved that quality in him for most of their marriage. She had depended on it. She had not understood until now what it cost to depend on a quality like that in a person who was no longer there to exercise it. The moving day was a Wednesday in early October. Agnes had organized it herself. She had called the movers, sorted through what could come with her, and what would go into the storage unit April had arranged in Millhaven. And she had done this over the course of 2 weeks with the focused attention of someone who has decided that the doing of things is the only reliable remedy for the feeling of things. April had offered to come. Agnes had thanked her and said no. This was hers to manage. The leaving after 32 years was hers to do in her own way, without an audience, even a loving one. She kept what mattered: Jean's photographs, the quilt his mother had made the year they were married, the coffee mug she had bought at a roadside stand in 1987 on the drive back from their first anniversary trip to the Smoky Mountains, the one with the chip in the handle that she had always meant to replace and never had. She kept the blue cardigan she had bought him for Christmas 3 years ago that he had worn until it was nearly see-through at the elbows because he said it was the warmest thing he owned. She left the furniture. Most of it was too large for where she was going, and some of it, the kitchen table, the reading chair by the window, carried a weight she was not yet ready to negotiate with. What she took, besides the suitcases, was the travel bag. It was an old canvas duffel, army green, the kind of bag that had been manufactured in the 1970s to last indefinitely and had done exactly that. Jean had carried it on every road trip they had taken in 40 years of marriage. She was taking it because it was his and because it smelled like him still, which she knew would not last but was true right now. And right now was what she had. The Ridgeway Motor Court was 12 minutes from the house on Calloway Street, which meant Agnes could, on the first night, lie in a narrow bed in room 9 and know that the house was still there, 12 minutes away, with someone else's key in the lock. There was no comfort in the proximity exactly, but there was something, a not yet fully gone, that she was not ready to give up before she had to. The room was clean and impersonal in the way of places that are maintained rather than cared for. A bed, a dresser, a television mounted too high on the wall, a window with a view of the parking lot and the highway beyond it. She set her suitcases in the corner. She set the travel bag on the dresser. She sat on the edge of the bed and was still for a while. The movement of the day had kept the worst of it at manageable distance. Now the movement had stopped. The room was quiet. April had texted 3 times, and Agnes had answered each one briefly and with more steadiness than she felt, because April worried in the specific way of daughters who cannot be there, and Agnes did not want to be the cause of that worry more than she already was. She was 71 years old. She had been a wife for 38 of those years and a widow for 7 months of them. And now she was also without the house where she had been a wife and a neighbor and a gardener's assistant and the person who made sure the bird feeder was filled every November through March. The losses were separate in nature, but they had arrived close enough together to feel, in the body, like a single sustained thing. She reached for the travel bag. She had not opened it since the morning she packed it, had taken it from the closet shelf, and placed Jean's folded cardigan on top, and zipped it closed. She opened it now. She lifted the cardigan and held it for a moment and set it beside her on the bed. Underneath it, her hand found the inner lining pocket, the one with the small zipper that Jean had always used for his gas station receipts on road trips. The zipper was closed. She did not remember closing it. She did not remember putting anything in it. She unzipped it. Inside was a folded piece of paper, and underneath the paper, attached to nothing, sitting loose in the bottom of the pocket, was a key. Old, single, the kind cut from a blank that had not been manufactured in 20 years. And tied to it with a short piece of twine was a small compass, brass, no larger than a quarter, with a crack across the crystal face on the northwest side. Agnes sat on the edge of the bed in room 9 at the Ridgeway Motor Court and unfolded the paper with hands that had gone very still. The paper was a single sheet, folded twice, the kind torn from a legal pad. She recognized Jean's handwriting immediately, the slightly cramped print of a man who had learned to write in a hurry and never fully unlearned it. All capitals, no cursive, every letter pressed hard enough into the page that you could feel the indentations on the back. He had not written much. Jean never wrote much when he could say a thing plainly. He had written that the key was for the Airstream. She read that line twice before she moved to the next one, because it required a moment of adjustment, the way any sentence does when it contains something you were not expecting and cannot immediately place. The Airstream. Her father's Airstream. Earl Hadley had owned a 1964 Airstream Ovalander for the last 20 years of his life, a silver travel trailer that he had bought secondhand in 1978 from a retired schoolteacher in Flagstaff and had driven across 15 states before his eyesight got bad enough that the doctors told him to stop. He had parked it on a plot of land he owned outside a small town called Deering in the high desert of eastern New Mexico, on a flat stretch of Mesa Road with a view of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains that he had described to Agnes in letters as the best view he had ever paid for with his own money, and he had paid very little for it, which made it better. Earl had died in 2009. Agnes had inherited the land, which was 4 acres of high desert scrub with no structure on it except the Airstream, which sat on a concrete pad. Her father had poured himself a summer. He decided he was not going to move it again. She had meant to deal with it. She had meant for years to deal with it. And the years had accumulated in the way that years do when you're living your actual life. And she had paid the property taxes every January without ever going back. She had assumed the Airstream had deteriorated beyond use. She had assumed this without checking, which was, she could see now, a particular kind of assumption, the kind you make when you do not want to go somewhere, and so you give yourself a reason not to. Gene had been there. That was what the note said. He had driven out to Deering in the spring of 2019, 3 years before he got sick, on a trip he had told her was a solo drive to see an old friend in Albuquerque, which she had accepted without question because Gene took solo drives occasionally and had done so for the length of their marriage, and she had always understood this as the way he refilled whatever it was that living closely with other people gradually emptied. He had needed those drives. She had never begrudged him them. He had gone to Deering. He had found the Airstream. And then, the note said, he had gone back 6 more times over the following 2 years. She counted the trips as she read, cross-referencing them against her memory of his absences, and each one matched. The friend in Albuquerque, the woodworking show in Santa Fe, the drive to see the wildflowers in the Jemez Mountains that he had shown her photographs of, photographs she now understood he had taken from the mesa outside Deering before turning the truck around. He had spent those trips restoring the Airstream. He wrote about it the way he spoke about everything mechanical, with the specificity of someone who found the details themselves to be the point. He had replaced the roof skin where it had separated at the seams. He had rebuilt the subfloor where the moisture had gotten in. He had rewired the electrical from scratch. He had refinished the interior panels in the original aluminum and replaced the dinette cushions with fabric he had ordered from a supplier in Oregon that matched the 1964 specification as closely as anything still being made could match it. He had done all of this, the note said, because he had always thought they would go there together. He had thought it would be the retirement trip that kept extending itself, the one you take when you finally have nowhere you are required to be. He had thought there was time. The last lines of the note were the shortest. He had written, "The engine runs. I had it serviced in October. The compass on the key is your father's. He left it on the dash. I thought you should have it back. Go see the view, Agnes. You will understand why he stayed." She sat with the note in her hands for a long time. Outside the window of room 9, a truck moved through the parking lot of the Ridgeway Motor Court, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling. She watched the light move and then disappear. She looked at the key. She looked at the brass compass with the cracked crystal face, northwest, the direction of nothing in particular except wherever you happen to be going. She placed the key and the compass on the nightstand beside the bed. She folded the note carefully along its original creases and put it in the front pocket of her cardigan, close, where she could reach it without looking. She did not sleep for a long time. When she did, it was with the particular quality of sleep that comes after the day has given you more than you expected, and the mind does not know what to do with the surplus except to go quiet and wait for morning. In the morning, she called April. April did not try to talk her out of it. That was the thing Agnes noticed first and appreciated most. She had expected the practical questions, the gentle redirection toward the assisted living brochures April had been collecting since February, the careful mothering that had developed between them over the 7 months since Jean died, the role reversal that happens when a parent becomes someone a child feels responsible for. She had prepared herself to be patient with all of it. Instead, April was quiet for a moment on the phone and then said, "How long is the drive?" 2 days, Agnes told her. Maybe 3 if she stopped where she needed to. April said she would track her location on the phone app they had set up after Jean's first hospitalization. Agnes agreed to this without argument because it was a reasonable request and because April needed something to do with the worry, and a blued up moving across a map was at least a concrete thing to watch. She left the Ridgeway Motor Court on a Friday morning before 7, the travel bag in the passenger seat, both suitcases in the trunk, and Jean's note in the front pocket of her cardigan, where it had been since the night she found it. She had studied the route the night before on her phone, printed it on paper at the motel's front desk, because she did not trust herself to follow a screen voice for 2 days without losing the thread, and tucked the printed pages into the visor above the driver's seat. The first hours out of Millhaven were the familiar geometry of the Mid-South, the interstate wide and indifferent, the landscape flat and then gently rolling and then flat again, the kind of driving that requires enough attention to keep you present and not enough to keep you from thinking. She had always done her clearest thinking on long drives. Jean had known this about her. On the hard decisions of their marriage, the house on Calloway Street, April's college, the years when money was tighter than she had admitted to anyone, Jean had a habit of suggesting they take a drive, which she had understood even then as his way of giving her the conditions she needed to find her own way to something. She thought about her father. Earl Hadley had been a quiet man of considerable internal weather, the kind of father who showed up reliably at every important thing and said little at any of them, whose love was legible in what he did rather than what he said. He had driven her to every college visit in a borrowed station wagon. He had fixed her first car 3 times without being asked and without mentioning the cost. When Jean had come to ask his permission, which Jean had done because he was that kind of man, Earl had shaken his hand and said only, "She makes her own decisions, but I'm glad it's you." She had not been back to Deering since the summer she and April had driven out to sort through his things after the funeral. April had been 11. They had spent 4 days in the small house her father rented in town, going through his belongings with the particular efficiency of grief, deciding what to keep and what to let go, and Agnes had driven out to the Airstream once alone in the early morning before April was awake. She had stood outside it in the high desert cold and looked at the mountains and understood without being able to articulate it why he had come here and kept coming back. Then she had driven town and made April breakfast, and they had finished packing and gone home. She had not gone back. 15 years. The landscape changed as she moved west and south, the Tennessee green giving way to the flatter brown of Arkansas, and then the wide sky of Oklahoma, and then the particular shift of the Texas Panhandle where the horizon pulled back so far in every direction that you felt for the first time in days that you could actually see where you were. She stopped that first night in Amarillo at a motel that was clean and unremarkable and ate soup from a can in the room with a map on the bed and the route marked in pen to Deering, which was still 4 hours south and west. She called April from the parking lot after dinner. April reported that the Blue had behaved itself all day. Agnes said she was fine and meant it, which surprised her a little. She was fine. She was driving toward something her husband had spent 3 years building for her in secret, across country that was getting more open and more honest the further west she went, with his compass in her coat pocket and his note against her chest, and she was, in a way she could not have predicted a week ago in the wreckage of the house on Calloway Street, fine. The second day was New Mexico. She had forgotten what New Mexico did to the light. It arrived differently here, harder and cleaner and from a higher angle, the kind of light that makes everything look like it is being seen for the first time. The scrub flats opened into mesa country and the road narrowed and the traffic thinned to almost nothing. And somewhere in the last hour before Deering, Agnes rolled the window down and let the cold, dry air come through, and held Jean's compass up against the windshield for a moment in the afternoon sun, and watched the needle find north. Deering was smaller than she remembered. The main street had 4 businesses open and 2 that had been closed long enough that the paint on their windows had gone opaque with dust and age. There was a feed store, a diner with a handwritten menu taped inside the glass, a post office the size of a garden shed, and a gas station at the edge of town where a teenager filled her tank without being asked and did not charge her for the window wash. She thanked him, and he nodded and went back inside, and that was Deering. She had the address from her father's old deed, which she had found in the storage unit files April kept organized in a plastic bin labeled documents. Dad. Amber Mesa Road, Parcel 4, approximately 6 miles east of town on the unpaved section past the cattle gate. She remembered the cattle gate. She remembered the way the road changed from asphalt to packed dirt about a mile before it, and the particular sound the car made when it crossed from one to the other, a sound like settling. She found the gate. She got out and opened it and drove through and got out again and closed it behind her because her father had taught her that you always close a gate you open on someone's land, and the instruction had stayed in the body the way instructions from parents do when they're given early enough and often enough. The road from the gate to the parcel was a little over a mile of hard pale dirt with scrub on both sides and the mountains in the distance going purple in the late afternoon light. She drove it slowly. The car was not built for dirt road, and she was not in a hurry. She saw the Airstream before she reached it. It sat on the concrete pad her father had poured, set back from the road behind a stand of juniper that had grown up around it over the years and given it the look of something that had always been there, that the land had arranged for its own purposes. The silver skin caught the afternoon light and held it, the way aluminum holds light differently from every other material, with a flatness and a brightness at once, a surface that looks dull from one angle and blinding from another. She pulled up alongside it and turned off the engine and sat for a moment. It was in better condition than she had any right to expect. That was the first thing. The seams were tight, the skin unbroken, the tires inflated and relatively new. The small awning above the door had been replaced, and the window frames had been resealed. She could see from a driver's seat that the step below the door was new aluminum, brighter than the rest, not yet weathered to match. She got out. The air was cold and thin and smelled of juniper and something mineral underneath it, the smell of the high desert that has no equivalent anywhere else and that hits the back of the throat like a specific memory you did not know you had retained. She walked around it once before she used the key. She wanted to see all of it first. The rear had been resealed where the skin had separated, the repair done cleanly and flush, nearly invisible unless you knew to look for it. The roof was sound. The hitch and the undercarriage had been cleaned and treated against rust. Gene had not done this quickly or casually. He had done it the way he did everything that mattered, with patience and without shortcuts, working from one end to the other and not moving forward until each piece was right. She put the key in the lock. It turned without resistance. She pushed the door open and stepped up into the Airstream. The smell that came out to meet her was wood and aluminum and something faintly like the soap her father had used, which was not possible after 15 years except that it was there, or she put it there, where the two things were not different in the way that memory and sensation are sometimes not different when you are standing in a place that holds a person you have lost. The interior was her father's and Jean's at once. The bones of it were Earl Hadley's, the layout unchanged from the original 1964 specification, the narrow galley kitchen on the left, the dinette across from it, the sleeping area in the rear behind a folding partition. But the surfaces were Jean's work. She knew it the way you know a voice you have been listening to for decades. The refinished aluminum panels buffed to an even satin finish, no bright spots, no streaks. The dinette cushions were covered in a warm tan fabric that was close enough to the original that you would not question it. The cabinet latches were placed with period-correct hardware, the kind you had to look for, the kind that required knowing what you were looking for. The floor had been relayed in narrow hardwood strips, dark and even, fitted with the precision that Gene brought to every surface he worked on. She knelt and ran her hand along the grain. She recognized the wood. It was the same species he had used for the workshop floor in the house on Calloway Street, which he had laid himself the summer April turned 16, working evenings and weekends over 6 weeks until it was exactly right. He had brought a piece of home here. He had built the floor of her father's Airstream from the same wood as their workshop floor, which meant he had thought about what it would feel like to stand in both places and had decided they should feel related. She sat down on the dinette cushion and looked at the floor for a while. On the small shelf above the galley sink, Gene had left 3 things. A road atlas, the spiral-bound kind from a gas station, opened and folded back to the page that showed New Mexico. A box of her father's favorite tea, the same brand he had ordered by mail for 40 years, still sealed. And the photograph. It was in a small frame, unadorned, the kind you find in a hardware store. Agnes and Earl at the Grand Canyon, 1987, the summer she and Gene had driven out west on their first long road trip and stopped at her parents' house in Flagstaff on the way back. Earl was squinting into the sun with the particular expression of a man who does not mind being photographed as long as it is over quickly. Agnes beside him was laughing at something off-frame. She did not remember what she had been laughing at. She wished she did. She sat in the Airstream in the late afternoon in Deering, New Mexico, with the mountains going darker outside the window and her father's tea on the shelf and Jean's floor under her feet, and she understood what Jean had written in the note. You'll understand why he stayed. She did understand. The view from the concrete pad, as the light left, it was the kind of view that makes a person want to account for themselves to no one, which is a very particular kind of rest, and which her father, who had spent 40 years accounting for himself to the railroad that employed him, would have needed more than most. She made tea on the small gas burner that Jean had serviced and left ready. She drank it at the dinette with the window open and the cold coming in and the mountains going from purple to black. She was in no hurry to do anything else. Brock Wentworth arrived on the third morning. Agnes was on the small folding chair she had found in the Airstream's exterior storage compartment, the kind of aluminum chair that weighs almost nothing and folds flat and has been manufactured in the same basic form since approximately 1955, drinking her second cup of tea and watching a hawk work the thermals above the mesa in long, unhurried circles. She heard the truck before she saw it, the particular sound of a heavy vehicle on packed dirt, and then it appeared around the stand of juniper and pulled up 20 feet from the concrete pad and stopped. The man who got out was perhaps 50, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of tan that comes from working outdoors rather than vacationing there. He wore a canvas jacket with a company logo on the chest she did not recognize and boots that were dusty enough to be genuine. He had the unhurried walk of someone who owns his own schedule, which in Agnes's experience was either a good sign or a bad one, depending entirely on what the person wanted. He introduced himself without being asked and told her the name of his company, which is a land development firm based in Santa Fe. He said he had heard from the county assessor's office that the parcel had come back into active use, which was how he put it, active use, as though the land had been asleep and was now causing problems by waking up. Agnes told him she was Earl Hadley's daughter. She said the land had always been hers. He nodded as though this confirmed something he already knew. He said he was aware of the ownership history, and that was actually why he was here. The Mesa Road corridor, he explained, had been the subject of significant development interest over the past several years. 3 of the 4 adjacent parcels had already been acquired by his firm. The views, the elevation, the proximity to the highway, the region's growth trajectory, all of it had made Amber Mesa Road attractive to buyers who were looking for something the more established markets in Taos and Santa Fe no longer offered. He had a number in mind. He said it the way people say, numbers they expect to be received well, with a slight pause before and a slight pause after, giving it room to land. It was not a small number. It was the kind of number that Agnes would have found difficult to contextualize 18 months ago, before the second mortgage and the bank's letter and the room at the Ridgeway Motor Court. She looked at him for a moment. The hawk above the mesa had found what it was looking for and dropped, and then risen again with something small and still in its talons, and was moving east now with purpose. What would you do with it? She asked. He described the project in the broad strokes of a man who has described it many times. A cluster of high-end retreat properties, each on a separate parcel, designed to work with the landscape rather than against it. His phrase, designed to work with it. Private, self-contained, oriented toward the view. The market for that kind of thing had grown considerably, he said. People with resources who wanted solitude and access both. He looked at the Airstream with the particular expression of someone calculating what it would cost to remove something. Agnes followed his gaze. She looked at the Airstream the way she had been looking at it for 3 mornings now, with the accumulating knowledge of someone who has started to understand what they are looking at. The silver skin and the morning light. The repaired seams. Jean's new step below the door, not yet weathered to match. She looked back at Wentworth. I'm not selling, she said. He received this with the professional composure of a man who has been told no before and has learned that the first no is rarely the final position. He asked whether she had considered the carrying costs. The property taxes on the Mesa corridor had increased considerably as the area developed, and with a fixed income and a property that generated nothing, the math had a way of becoming uncomfortable over time. She had considered it. She had been considering it since the second morning, sitting at the dinette with a legal pad and a pen, writing the numbers down the way she had always worked through things that needed working through, on paper, without distortion in either direction. The numbers were not comfortable. She was not going to pretend they were comfortable. But Jean had serviced the engine in October. The note had said so. She had checked it herself on the second morning, turning the key in the ignition the way you approach something you are half afraid of, and the engine had started on the second try and run evenly and without complaint. A 1964 Airstream with a running engine and a sound structure and a floor Jean had laid from the same wood as their workshop floor was not something you handed to a developer named Brock Wentworth because the property taxes were uncomfortable. He left his card on the arm of her folding chair. He said he hoped she would give it serious thought and that he was available whenever she wanted to talk. He walked back to his truck with the same unhurried confidence he had arrived with. But she noticed he did not look back at the Airstream as he pulled away, and she thought that told her something about how he saw it, as an obstacle rather than a thing, and that the difference between those two ways of seeing was exactly the distance between what he wanted and what she had. She picked up the card. She looked at it. She sat on the shelf inside the Airstream, next to the road atlas and her father's tea. Then she went inside and made a third cup and sat at the dinette and watched the mountains. Otis Crane walked the Mesa Road every morning at 6:30, which Agnes learned on her fourth day, when she woke before dawn and heard footsteps on the packed dirt, and looked out the Airstream window to find a man moving past at a pace that suggested he had somewhere to be and had decided the walking was the point rather than the destination. He was perhaps 65, leaning in the way of people who have been physically active long enough that it has stopped being effort and become structure. He wore a faded work shirt and carried nothing. On the fifth morning, when Agnes was outside with her tea, and they were close enough that ignoring each other would have required deliberate effort, he stopped and said, "Good morning," and she said it back, and that was the beginning of it. His name was Otis Crane. He had lived in Deering for 11 years, having arrived from Albuquerque after a career restoring vintage travel trailers and recreational vehicles that had started as a weekend hobby in his 30s and become his entire professional life by his mid-40s. He had a small workshop 2 miles down the Mesa Road where he took in trailers from across the Southwest, the older ones, the ones worth saving, and returned them to something close to what they had been when they left the factory, which in the case of the better American manufacturers of the mid-20th century was considerably better than most of what was currently being produced. He had noticed the Airstream the week Agnes arrived. He had been noticing it for years, he told her, watching it sit and wondering about it, the way anyone who works with a particular kind of object develops a relationship with examples of it they encounter in the world, a recognition that is almost involuntary. She invited him to look at it. He spent the better part of a morning going through the Airstream with the focused attention of a man who has looked at a great many trailers and knows immediately when he is looking at something that does not fit the usual distribution. He moved through it slowly, running his hands along the panel seams, crouching to examine the subfloor repair, opening the cabinet doors and closing them with the particular care of someone testing the precision of the fit. When he came out, he sat in the folding chair Agnes had set up beside hers and was quiet for a moment in the way of someone organizing what they want to say. "Your husband did this restoration," he said. She confirmed it. He shook his head slowly, which she understood was not a negative response. "The subfloor work alone," he said, "was the kind of repair that most professional restoration shops got wrong because they used materials that were easier to source rather than materials that were correct. Jean had used the right materials. The aluminum skin repairs were flush to within tolerances that Otis said he would have been satisfied with in his own shop. The electrical rewire had been done to the original schematic, which required finding the original schematic, which was not straightforward for a 1964 model. He had done his homework, Otis said. Whoever he was, he had done his homework, and then he had done the work to match it. Agnes told him about Jean. She told him about the solo drives, and the note, and the compass, and the key. She told him about 38 years of a man who solved things quietly and brought them to her finished. Otis listened without interrupting, which she appreciated, and when she finished he looked at the Airstream for a long moment. He said, "I know what this is worth." Not to Wentworth, to the right person. She asked him what he meant. He explained it the way people explain things they know thoroughly, without performance, moving from one concrete fact to the next. The 1964 Airstream Overlander was among the most sought-after models in vintage trailer collecting, not because it was the largest or the most luxurious, but because the manufacturing quality of that particular year represented a standard the company itself had not consistently maintained before or after. A fully restored example in genuine condition, not a cosmetic refresh, but a structural restoration using correct materials and period hardware, was rare enough that Otis said he could count on one hand the examples he considered legitimate. He offered to write a formal assessment of the Airstream, a documented evaluation of its condition, its provenance as far as it could be established, and its market value among serious collectors and restoration enthusiasts. He said he would do it without charge because the trailer deserved to be properly understood before any decision was made about it, and because Jean's work deserved a record. She thanked him and asked why, directly, because she had learned by 71 that accepting things without understanding the terms was how you found yourself in situations you had not chosen. He looked at the Airstream again. "Because I have been doing this for 30 years, he said, "and I have never seen a restoration done with this quality of intention. Your husband was not restoring a trailer. He was building something for you. That is different from everything else I've seen in this work, and it should not go unrecognized." Agnes called April that evening. She told her about Otis. She told her she needed a few more days. April said the blue duck could stay endearing as long as it needed to. The following morning, Otis introduced her to Vivian Hale. Vivian had practiced property and estate law in Taos for 25 years, and it's been a significant portion of those years working with clients whose assets did not fit the standard categories: land with complicated histories, structures with cultural or architectural significance, properties that required a different kind of thinking than a straightforward transaction. She was direct and unhurried and asked good questions, the kind that showed she had already thought carefully about the situation before arriving. She confirmed what Otis had described about the Airstream's value and added the dimension he had not fully covered. The land itself, the 4 acres on Amber Mesa Road, had appreciated in a way that made Wentworth's offer, while not dishonest, considerably below what the parcel would support in the right transaction. The adjacent development had raised values along the entire corridor. The combination of the land and a documented vintage restoration of genuine significance was an asset that required careful handling rather than a quick decision made under financial pressure. She could help with that, Vivian said. She knew the market and the legal structures and the options that existed between selling outright and simply holding on and hoping the property taxes stayed manageable. Agnes listened and asked her questions. She had managed a household for 38 years. She understood numbers, and she understood options, and she understood the difference between a decision made from fear and a decision made from clarity. She was beginning to have a different idea. She called April on a Sunday evening with the mountains going orange outside the Airstream window and laid out the idea the same way she had always laid out the things that needed thinking through from the beginning without rushing toward the conclusion, letting the shape of it emerge as she talked. April listened the way she had learned to listen to her mother over the past 7 months, without the impulse to fix or redirect, just tracking the logic as it moved. When Agnes finished, April was quiet for a moment and then said, "You've already decided." Agnes said she had not decided. She was thinking out loud. April said, "Mom, you decided when you turned the key in the ignition and the engine started." Agnes looked at the road atlas on the shelf above the galley sink, still folded open to New Mexico. She thought April was probably right. The idea was not complicated in its outline, though Vivian had been correct that the execution required specific legal structuring and a working knowledge of the county's zoning provisions for the Mesa corridor, which Vivian had and Agnes did not and did not need to, which was why you found the right person and then trusted them to do the work they knew how to do. Agnes would not sell the land. She would not sit on it while the property taxes grew into a problem. She would use it. The Airstream was sound, and Jean had serviced the engine, and the structure was as tight as anything Otis had seen in 30 years of working with vintage trailers. What it was not was connected to utilities, which it did not need to be, and permanent, which it did not need to be either, and it was on 4 acres of high desert mesa with a view of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains that Otis had told her, without exaggeration, people drove from 3 states away to photograph. There was a market, Vivian confirmed, for exactly this kind of experience. Not the resort market Wentworth was building toward on the adjacent parcels, but a different and older and in some ways more durable market. The people who wanted something specific and rare and could not find it in the places that had been developed for the purpose. A restored 1964 Airstream Ovalander on a private mesa with an unobstructed mountain view and no neighbors visible in any direction was not something you found by searching the usual platforms. It was something you found because someone who had been there told someone else, and so on, in the way that the genuinely rare things circulate. She would offer the Airstream as a rental, one booking at a time. Short stays, the kind of stay where you come to be somewhere specific rather than to do something scheduled. She would manage it herself, from the Airstream if she wanted, from wherever she happened to be if she did not. Otis knew the property well enough to check on it between bookings. Vivian would structure the legal arrangements to protect the asset. The renovation needed to prepare it for guests took 6 weeks, which was less than Agnes had budgeted and more thorough than she had initially planned. Because once she started, she found that Jean's standard was also her standard, and there was no point doing it any other way. She added a proper outdoor shower, enclosed on 3 sides with cedar that Otis helped her source, because the outdoor shower was the kind of thing that sounds unnecessary until you have stood outside in the high desert morning with the cold coming off the mountains and understood that it is the only sensible way to start a day in a place like this. She added a proper fire ring with a flat stone surround that she designed herself, and Otis helped her lay over 2 afternoons. She added lighting along the flat stone path from the parking area to the Airstream, low and warm, the kind that shows you where to put your feet without competing with the stars. She kept Jean's floor. She kept her father's tea on the shelf, replacing the original box with the same brand ordered from the same mail supplier her father had used, which still existed and still carried it. She kept the photograph of herself and Earl at the Grand Canyon in its hardware store frame on the shelf beside the Atlas. She added one thing of her own. On the exterior beside the Airstream door, she mounted a small plaque in brushed aluminum, because aluminum was what the Airstream was made of, and she thought the material should match. It said, "Earl Hadley parked here first." Jean Caldwell brought it back. Agnes Caldwell opened the door. Otis had helped her get the wording right over 2 evenings at the dinette with cups of her father's tea. She had known what she wanted it to say, but not quite how, and Otis had a patience for the exact word that she had not expected and respected when she found it. The first guests arrived on a Friday in April, a couple from Denver who had found the listing through a travel writer who had somehow heard about the Airstream and driven out to see it and written about it in a publication Agnes had never read. They stayed 4 nights. On their last morning, Agnes found a note they had left on the dinette table, written on a page torn from the Road Atlas's index, because that was the paper that was there. It said, "We did not know a place could feel like this. Thank you for keeping it." Agnes read it twice. She folded it and put it in the front pocket of her cardigan, next to Jean's note, which was still there, which was still where she reached for it without thinking when the day asked more of her than she had easily available. By summer, the calendar was full through September. Wentworth had driven the Mesa Road twice in May, which she had noted from her folding chair without particular feeling. He had not stopped either time. On an evening in late October, with the last booking of the season checked out that morning and the Mesa Road quiet in the way it got when the summer visitors stopped coming and the desert returned to itself, Agnes sat in her folding chair outside the Airstream and watched the sun go down over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The light at this hour on this stretch of mesa was the thing her father had tried to describe in his letters and had never quite managed. Not because he lacked the words, but because the thing itself resisted description the way certain true things do. It was not golden exactly. It was the color of something older than gold, a red-orange that came up from the rock and met the light coming down from the sky, and for 20 minutes made the entire landscape look like it was lit from within rather than from above. She held the compass in her hand, the brass one, her father's, with the cracked crystal face on the northwest side. She had carried it every day since the night she found it in the lining of Jean's travel bag in room 9 at the Ridgeway Motor Court, which was 4 months ago now, though the distance between that night and this evening felt longer than 4 months in the way that certain periods of life compress or expand depending on what happens inside them. She thought about her father standing on this concrete pad in 1978 with a second-hand Airstream and a view he had paid very little for. She thought about him coming back year after year, parking in the same spot, making tea on the same small burner, watching the same mountains go through their changes. He had been 61 when he stopped driving. He had parked the Airstream on the pad and poured the concrete himself and left it there, and she understood now that leaving it was not giving up. It was keeping it. It was his way of saying this place is real and I will come back to it, even when he could not. Jean had understood that. Jean had driven out here alone in the spring of 2019 and stood where Agnes was sitting now and seen what her father had seen and decided it was worth bringing back. He had spent 3 years doing it on the weekends when he told her he was somewhere else, carrying materials and working alone in the high desert with the mountains in front of him, and whatever he was thinking kept to himself. In the workshop at 11 at night way, he had always processed the things that mattered most. She had spent time with the anger of that, the kept secret, the solo decision. She did not pretend she hadn't. There had been evenings in the first weeks at the Airstream when she had sat at Jean's dinette, on Jean's cushions on Jean's restored floor, and been straightforwardly furious at him for doing something this large without telling her, for deciding alone what she would want, for being so certain he was right that he had not felt the need to ask. The trouble was that he had been right. That was the specific difficulty of being angry at someone who loved you with the kind of attention that allows a person to know what you would choose before you choose it. He had been right about the Airstream. He had been right about the view. He had been right that she would understand why her father stayed, and right that she needed to come here alone to understand it, and right that a key and a compass and a note in the lining of a travel bag was the correct way to give it to her, because it gave her the finding of it herself, which he had known she would need. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 38 years of that kind of attention, and she was still discovering its edges. The mountains had gone from orange to red to the deep bruised purple they turned in the last minutes before full dark. A pair of ravens moved along the ridge below the mesa, calling back and forth in the low conversational tone they used when they were not alarmed, just present, just accounting for each other across a short distance. She thought about the plaque beside the Airstream door. Earl Hadley parked here first. Jean Caldwell brought it back. Agnes Caldwell opened the door. Otis had suggested once, gently, that the last line might be too plain, that she might want something with more weight to it. She had told him the plainness was the point. Opening a door was not a small thing. It was what you did after everything else had been done for you, and it was finally your turn to do something. It was the part that required you. She ran her thumb across the cracked crystal face of the compass. Northwest. The crack ran from the bezel to the center, a clean line, the kind of break that happens when something is dropped once on a hard surface and lands at exactly the wrong angle. She did not know when her father had dropped it. She did not know the story of the crack. This was one of the things about the dead that you learned to carry, the gaps that would not be filled, the questions that had no one left to answer them. What she had was what Jean had left her. The key, the note, the floor laid from the same wood as home, the tea on the shelf, and the photograph of her father squinting into the sun. The engine that started on the second try. The 2 chairs, hers and the one Otis sat in now when he came by in the evenings, which was not Jean's chair and was not her father's chair, and was just a chair, which was its own kind of rightness. The bank had taken a house on Calloway Street. It had taken Jean's kitchen table and the workshop he had built in the backyard, and the garden he had kept going for 32 years with the stubbornness of a man who believed a garden left alone was a garden given up on. It had taken all of it cleanly and without malice, the way institutions take things, according to the terms of agreements that are real and binding and do not make exceptions for the life that happened inside the collateral. What the bank had not known about was a travel bag in a closet on Calloway Street with a key in the lining and a note in Jean's hard-pressed capitals and a brass compass with a cracked face. What it had not known about was 4 acres of high desert mesa in Deering, New Mexico, paid for outright in her father's name and passed her clean, with no loan against it and no claim on it, and a 1964 Airstream sitting on a concrete pad with Jean's floor inside it and the best view either man had ever found waiting outside the door every morning. She got up from the folding chair. She went inside. She made tea on the small burner and stood at the galley window while it steeped and looked at the last color leaving the sky above the mountains. She thought about what she would write on the postcard she was sending April tomorrow. She had started sending postcard in the first weeks, one a week, choosing the ones that showed the light the way it actually was here, and April had told her she put them on the refrigerator, and Agnes had started choosing more carefully after that. She would write about the ravens. She would write about the light at this hour that her father had tried to describe and could not. She would write, "Gene knew about this view before I did. He saved it for me the same way my father saved it for himself. I think that is what the people who love us do with the best things they find. They save them until we are ready." She carried her tea to the folding chair and sat back down. The stars were coming out over the mesa in the unhurried way of stars at altitude. One, and then a few, and then all at once more than you can hold in your attention. The compass was warm from her hand. The mountains were dark shapes now against a sky that was not yet fully black, holding the last of the light the way the mountains here always held it a little longer than the sky did, as though the rock itself was reluctant to let the day go. Agnes sat and held the compass and was in the plain and ordinary and complete way of a person who has found where they're supposed to be, at home. If Agnes's story moved you in any way, hit that like button so this story of love and resilience can reach more people who need it today. A warm embrace to each and every one of you. I'll see you in the next story. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.